Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new sci-fi epic Dune Part 2. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So coming 3 years after Dune Part 1, audiences finally have the chance to be transported back to the spice-infused sands of Arrakis. And for me, I think like a lot of people, this has been a film that has been one of my most anticipated of the year. And I think a lot like Dune Part 1, this film kind of makes two things very clear. One, that Dune, the book, is just a difficult book to adapt into film. But I think second, that director Denis Villeneuve is absolutely the right guy to make that attempt. Because much like a Fremen warrior riding a gigantic sandworm, Denis Villeneuve somehow manages to harness and steer what is a very kind of unwieldy, kind of sweeping story, and turn it into something that is very exciting and immersive. I think this is definitely a complicated film to get into, but I think overall for me, Dune Part 2 is a triumphant, it's a sweeping sci-fi spectacle that is sort of both visually impressive as well as just sort of thematically complicated in the way that it wrestles with, I think, interesting themes of kind of the interplay of faith and religion and power. I do think that although it's not without some content areas or themes for Christians to consider, which we'll get into later in this review, I think overall, this is a film that will definitely please fans just looking for kind of an exciting spectacle on an epic scope. And like I said, this is a notoriously tricky book to adapt into film because in many ways author Frank Herbert was attempting to kind of subvert a lot of the classic storytelling tropes that others like George Lucas and would later kind of lean more heavily into, kind of asking questions, like what if the chosen one resisted the call, not because they felt unworthy, but because they were scared that they were too powerful? Or what if the rebellion to sort of overthrow the big empire would lead to sort of a violent, bloody, holy war rather than lasting peace? And I think maybe more potent for Christians is this: what if sort of the prophesized Messiah was a moment to dread rather than something to celebrate? And I think because of that, in many ways, kind of the same aspects of the story that make it very unique and interesting can also kind of make it slightly less accessible to modern audiences. But thankfully, director Villeneuve does a lot of heavy lifting to translate this complicated story into a very crowd-pleasing, big cinematic event. Because as expected from the first movie, this movie looks superb. The sheer scope and spectacle of this story really do elevate it into like kind of the epitome of a Hollywood blockbuster, and I think one that does this demand to be seen on like the biggest screen possible. Because even during like the climactic third act of this film, where there's battles and big sandworms and explosions going around, I kind of glanced around the theater that I was viewing it in, and I could see multiple people who were like literally sitting at the edge of their seat, kind of just soaking in the spectacle and the excitement. And I think I lost count of the number of kind of slow motion epic shots of Paul Atreides sort of walking slowly as his cape billows in the wind, and Hans Zimmer's bombastic score is just blaring behind him. Is it a little overkill? Perhaps, but it's just so cool. And there's so many just sort of exciting moments and visuals like that all throughout this film. And the quality craftsmanship is evident in just sort of other areas as well. I think in a very inspired, creative decision, kind of the home planet of House Harkonnen, who are sort of the bald villains in the story, all those scenes are rendered completely in black and white, which just very effectively gives it a very like otherworldly aura and almost like a retro vibe to it. And this is a film that clocks in at nearly 3 hours of the runtime. But despite that, and I think despite being a little disjointed, at least in like the first act of this, the film never drags or feels slow. The pacing in this is great, and kind of the way it moves between the big action kind of spectacles and like the slower, kind of more, character moments. And it's also just a well acted film. Don't have time to go through the whole cast because it is a very sprawling cast with recognizable names, but kind of the newly introduced villain in this, who's played by actor Austin Butler, is just magnetic whenever he's on screen, despite fairly, I think, limited screen time and just sort of a worthy addition to a cast that's already brimming with talent. But despite all these successes and kind of strengths that this film has going for it, I do think some of the difficulties of the novel do carry over into the adaptation. And one dilemma of an adaptation of this story is that Dune is essentially about a protagonist that is sort of increasingly unrelatable and like almost inhuman. Because in many ways, Paul Atreides in this is almost more like an idea than he is a person. And obviously, not every protagonist in stories needs to be a humble farmer with a heart of gold. And I do think sort of Paul's journey from this sort of human person to just kind of being reduced to this symbol is an intentional central component to the story itself. It's just that, at least for me, I felt like the film doesn't always sort of push deeper beyond kind of the bigger conceptual themes to get to more like the personal material. Because Paul's struggles in this are almost viewed like at a distance through the eyes of the characters around him, particularly the character played by Zendaya, rather than kind of allowing audiences to really get into like Paul's own headspace. And kind of a similar thing applies to Lady Jessica, who is played by the always great Rebecca Ferguson, whose character is always like a constant presence that's mysteriously pulling strings and maneuvering, but her character is almost so mystical and like detached from regular human emotion that she almost seems to like transcend just character depth itself. And kind of as a result, like Paul in this, he wants revenge. Jessica assumedly wants power. And these almost become like the sole motivations for their action without ever getting too deep into like the internal conflict behind those desires that would have, I think, made their journeys just a bit more compelling. And kind of as a result, Dune Part 2 sometimes feels like it's a lot of plot, kind of intermixed with some thrilling action scenes and then some kind of complex philosophical concepts layered on top. And I will say too, this movie, just like the book, does seem to end like fairly abruptly right when like the big action and events seem to just be kind of getting into place, which does seem to pave the way for kind of the inevitability of Dune Part 3, which, hey, I will be up for that, but it does result in an ending that feels somewhat incomplete and even unsatisfying. As far as content to consider, things kind of going on the surface of this film, there is some stuff, although I don't think overly much. As far as language, there's not a whole lot. I counted maybe 3 to 4 kind of minor profanities. Violence, obviously, this is a movie that's sort of centered in on like war, so you do get a lot of action scenes and a lot of soldiers that get stabbed or shot and killed in battle, although mostly armored and helmeted and kind of relatively bloodless action. Where the more explicit violence in this comes is with the Harkonnen, sort of the villains in this, who are portrayed as being very ruthless and even sadistic. And there are multiple scenes, kind of instances where one of them will kind of murder their subordinates by either like slashing their throat or in one case like pounding one's head kind of repeatedly against a desk. And one scene you do sort of hear from like behind a closed door, you hear like pained screams, and then later as some characters enter the room, you do see like 2 kind of dead bodies sprawled out on the floor. And the Fremen, who are like the natives to this planet, also have a practice of like draining the corpses of their enemies for their valuable water. And you don't necessarily see that close up in camera beyond one sort of brief shot where you do see one of these characters kind of face get shriveled up. And kind of lastly, it's implied, although not shown, that some of sort of these kind of subordinates of the Harkonnens are in fact cannibals. As far as sexuality in this, it's mostly suggestive rather than anything that's depicted like in camera. There's a scene where a man and woman are lying in bed together and kissing, and presumably they're both nude, having just had sex, although the camera only shows them from kind of the shoulders up. In another scene, there's a woman that seduces a man kind of for political maneuvering, and the actual sexual encounter is not shown, but in a later scene, you see that the woman has become pregnant, and she does refer to that man as sort of being sexually vulnerable. The only other kind of content stuff for this is just that religion is featured kind of very prominently, and we're going to get into that with the themes, but there are various sort of religious rituals, and you see characters praying, and kind of like the Bene Gesserit order, which is sort of this kind of order of these powerful women that seem to have these sort of almost superhuman power, and they are referred to as times like as witches, although in the context of the story, their powers are like the result of like genetics and science and breeding, rather than any kind of spiritual origin. As far as themes, things going on beneath the surface of this film, I think this is where things get really interesting. Because, like I said, talk of faith and religion and like messiahs and is spread all throughout this film, and it is very central to the story of Dune, and it is often kind of portrayed in a very negative light, which I know from the first Dune movie and doing a review for that some Christians were hesitant or even put off by sort of the portrayal of religion. But personally, I think it is maybe overly simplistic to just decry this as like an anti-Christian movie, or even to like forcefully attempt to do like a one-to-one correlation between like Paul Atreides and Jesus, or the Bene Gesserit and Christians, or that the religion in this story is bad, therefore the movie is saying that religion is bad. Because in an interview, author Frank Herbert once stated this. He said, "What I'm saying in my books boils down to this: mind religion for what is good and avoid what is deleterious. Don't condemn people who need it. Be very careful when that need becomes fanatical." In other words, I think the themes that he was going for in Dune, which I think is communicated through this film, is less like a very antagonistic assault on religion as much as it is like a cautionary tale against the danger of like exploiting religion for the sake of power. Because Dune at its core is really a story all about power, kind of who truly has power and what does it take to gain power. Because really all the different factions, all the different characters in this story are really all working towards that goal of achieving power, although using various different means, whether that's manipulation or just blunt force, or even like religion. And there's a really fascinating quote early in this film where sort of Zendaya's character says, "If you want to control people, tell them a messiah will come." And kind of in an interesting twist, which was revealed in Dune Part 1, like all the sort of prophecies that were seeming to set up Paul to be sort of the long-awaited Messiah were actually fabrications by the Bene Gesserit kind of missionaries over many years, sort of planting a seed in order to kind of, take control of the Fremen later when they needed to. And it provides a very interesting contrast just to the Bible, where the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians declares that if Christ wasn't truly resurrected, then all of their faith has been in vain, and Christians should be pitied most of all people. And kind of like according to the Bible, like a faith sort of built on a false gospel is a tragedy, like a very meaningless pursuit. And you sort of see the other side of that in Dune, where sort of a faith built on a lie makes really no difference as long as it can be harnessed into sort of a tool to gain power. And kind of at the fundamental level, obviously the worldview of the Bible and Dune diverge in very significant ways, where Christianity is based on a true gospel, whereas sort of the prophecies in Dune are false, both like in the story and also just because they're the product of an imaginative sci-fi stories. Although I do think like on the surface, Christians can share and kind of affirm some of Dune's caution just against the kind of abuse of faith. I think we need not look any further than like the realm of politics to see how religion can be wielded as sort of a pathway to influence and power, regardless of like the authenticity of sort of the underlying faith. So whereas Dune, I think, offers a much more like pessimistic view towards religion and does expose very real dangers of sort of a faith built on falsehoods for selfish gains. Christians, I think, can be a lot more hopeful, obviously knowing that their faith is built on truth, but also that Jesus calls them to a life of submission rather than just sort of dominance and power. So in the end, I enjoyed this movie a lot. I did feel similar watching Dune Part 2 as I did, I think, reading the original Dune novel, where I was captivated by the immersive world building and sort of the conceptual ideas, even if I was left just a little bit cold by the characters. But I think despite some of those concerns, this is arguably as good as an adaptation of this book as feasibly possible. I think Villeneuve infuses this narrative with incredible spectacle, just thrilling action, while staying kind of true and consistent with sort of the world building and the philosophical ideas that are so central to the novel. I think as with the first film and even the original novel, Christians will likely be divided on this, whether, regarding the religious themes, the implications, and kind of how they interpret that, how they approach that. But at least to me, when just taking this as an entertaining film, Dune Part 2 is definitely a triumph. But hey, I would love to hear what you guys think. Obviously, this is a movie that just sort of, almost demands to be discussed. So don't be shy. Jump in the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys to subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. I get lots of movie reviews and podcasts and interviews and just other fun stuff. We'd love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.